Hello, everybody out there in the wide world of the internet, vis-a-vis Blab, etc. I'm being joined today by the esteemed Alfie Bown, who is blog Everyday Analysis, also reader and author for Zero Books. And the sort of point of departure for our conversation today is his book, Candy Crush and Capitalism, in which we can begin by interrogating the conception of enjoyment which pervades and directs our culture, and how capitalism has informed the manner in which that conception has come to be, and are there problems with it? What are those problems? How can we respond to that, and so forth. So would you say that's a fair characterization of how you address those issues in your book, Alfie? Or how would you put it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, the book's called Enjoying It, Candy Crush and Capitalism, and it's basically an attempt to think about how we are sort of influenced and maybe controlled and regulated through our enjoyment. So I'm looking at different kinds of enjoyment in a capitalist society and trying to work out what role different kinds of enjoyment play, especially in relation.
Could go on. I'm sorry. I was just going to ask for you to enumerate, what would you say are those dominant forms or modes of enjoyment?
Sure. So one thing I'm sort of looking at is the difference between what is generally considered to be sort of good enjoyment and what people dismiss usually as kind of mindless crap. On the one hand, you've got something like arts, highbrow cinema, reading intelligent literature, and these things are considered to be kind of legitimate forms of entertainment by our culture. And I am interested in those things, and I do discuss them in the book. But my main interest is, in fact, in the things which we consider to be completely mindless forms of enjoyment, which are kind of maybe illegitimate or they're considered to be what I talk about in terms of kind of unproductive enjoyment. So things like mobile phone games, BuzzFeed tabs, basically things that our general society considers to be completely useless and mindless, and therefore barely ever interrogates. I'm interested in kind of looking at those things in more detail and saying, are these things completely mindless, or do they serve a particular kind of like social and cultural purpose?
So what comes to mind as you sort of hash things out there, two things sort of came to my mind. One was that you actually sort of vaguely reminded me of a distinction, which I think is struck by John Stuart Mill in his framing of utilitarianism, where you have a sort of set of more sublime modes of enjoyment, and he invokes that distinction to try and evade what are considered some of the more atrocious consequences that can sometimes be elicited from a too sort of gross adoption of a utilitarian framework, which might be just a curious observation, though it may be possible to link utilitarianism with how capitalism understands human happiness and maybe get something out of that. The second thing that came to mind was, where you noted that there's a distinction about productivity, right? And so-called legitimate forms of enjoyment are somehow linked to productivity, but somehow we're then drawn to these mindless distractions, cell phone games, etc., which are designated as specifically unproductive. And maybe we could really start there, right, where the concept of productivity and how it informs our conception of human being under capitalism is that, we could go down that line. But then thirdly, and I'm just going to leave it to you to decide, where to pick up for my response here, there's the psychoanalytic dimension. And maybe this is what you're positing, is that these mindless forms of enjoyment, while seemingly an utter waste of time, may actually have a subversive function to fulfill, because they serve and address needs which are actually left unmet by what capitalism nominally will give us. So why don't you respond? I'm sorry, I threw an awful lot out there, but why don't you go ahead?
I love what you're saying there.
Yeah, great. So let me quickly mention the respond to your comment about utilitarianism. I do discuss a little bit Jeremy Bentham in the book. I'm not sure if I did mention Mill, but yeah, certainly what I am getting at, there is a link there, because what I am getting at is the way that these things are kind of harnessed and become useful. So that the question of usefulness would relate to kind of ideas of utilitarianism. And one of the things I kind of say in the book is that we are in the Victorian period, there was a kind of regulation and control of enjoyment, and utilitarianism would be related to that. In fact, I sort of first came up with the idea for the book when my wife was studying history, and she studied the history of 19th century Britain. And obviously I'd known about the kind of Great Reform Act of 1832 and how this was designed to kind of crush the working class. And because at this time Britain was on the brink of revolution, well, as close as it's ever come anyway. So the people in positions of power tried to kind of prevent another uprising happening via regulating and controlling people's recreation. And this is something I'd never heard of. My wife was studying history and came telling me all these really interesting things about how the Victorian period tried to control people's leisure time. Now, anyway, basically I sort of stole her ideas and applied them to enjoyment, because it occurred to me that we're in a similar kind of moment where I think our enjoyment is regulated and controlled and harnessed and used by a kind of capitalist system. That would be a connection I draw in the book between the control of leisure time in the Victorian period and the control of enjoyment and regulation of enjoyment today. And that would also connect it up quite nicely with your point about utilitarianism. But mainly, let me pick up on your more central point about my discussions of productivity, which I think is the right, this is the heart of my argument in the book, really. What I'm trying to sort of establish is that these things which seem like completely unproductive forms of enjoyment actually serve a useful, productive end. So take something like Candy Crush, which is it's on the front cover of the book. But it's just one example for me of many kinds of distracting enjoyment, which probably I would say characterizes our relationship to enjoyment in this particular moment. Whether that's internet tabs, YouTube videos, mobile phone games. These are what Walter Benjamin calls a culture of distraction, in which we're constantly distracted from work. Now, my argument is not that. You can obviously anticipate the argument that, it's so terrible that we're so distracted. It would be better if we were concentrating on really important stuff. I'm just not saying that at all. What I'm trying to show is that these things which distract us, which seem useless, which seem like the opposite of productive work, are actually making us into better capitalists. So therefore, Candy Crush is productive and it serves a capitalist agenda. I'll try and explain a little bit.
So, could you, at that moment, elaborate what you mean by productivity? Because there's a tension within that term, which I think would be useful to illuminate. You're talking about specifically a capitalist productivity, right? Where you can maybe sort of generalize the term in ways which are actually even anti-capitalist, right? You can do things which are productive. So could you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I'm saying is that these games, these types of distraction, they are played on the way to work, going to and from work, and in the workplace. So what my investigation is into what role they play in relation to work. Now, I don't really think that we play Candy Crush on a Sunday morning while we have a cup of coffee. Maybe some people do, but to me it seems like a particularly connected to work And so what I'm trying to investigate is this relationship between distractions and work. And it's my argument that there's a kind of guilt complex involved, or a guilt function involved in these games and these distractions. So what we do is we play 5 minutes of Candy Crush while our boss or our employer is not looking, and then this stimulates a kind of unconscious guilt, which we feel we have to make up for by producing more capitalist kind of profit. So we kind of enjoy these games, and this is a kind of counterpart of the argument. I think that we enjoy these games, for example, because we tell ourselves, "Oh, I've wasted so much time on Candy Crush," and that makes us feel like our job is a useful and productive use of time when compared with Candy Crush.
Yeah, that's very keen. And in fact, I haven't had the opportunity to really look at your text yet, and I had not anticipated that to be the line you would take at all, and I think it's quite insightful. What I had thought would be that the sort of distractiveness itself simply kind of degrades the quality of our consciousness in a way which makes it sort of more pliable, which is relative. I think that happens too, but I think you're onto something which is subtler, more pernicious even than that simple sort of leech of our attentive capacity. I mean, do you think that this happens formally, informally, both, the degree to which these kinds of distractions feed into us being more effective workers?
Yeah, both informally and formally, and both consciously and unconsciously. And yeah, I think you're right. The expectation would be that the argument would be that, it was better in the old days before we had all this degrading distraction. That's really not where I'm coming from with it. I think this kind of distraction is, very, very much designed to affect our relationships to work, and this can be conscious and unconsciously. For example, I think that we turn to these distracting mobile phone games, for instance, at the very moment when we feel dissatisfied with our working conditions. So you're at work, you're feeling a bit fed up, you've had enough of what you're being told to do, being paid to do, what you need to do in the workplace, and so you take 5 minutes on Candy Crush. Now, what that does then, the 5 minutes that you would have been thinking about your dissatisfaction, your working conditions, is instead plugged into a game which stops you then actually reflecting on your working conditions, right? First and foremost, you spend the 5 minutes on Candy Crush instead of thinking about how awful your working conditions are. And then on top of that, it's made you feel guilty for wasting time. So it sort of turns you back round into work with a renewed passion for the work which you were initially dissatisfied with. So basically, it turns your dissatisfaction with your working conditions into a renewed energy to work hard for your employer.
It's sort of in that mechanism that you're describing, that there's also a power relationship, right? So why are you feeling guilty toward your not having made adequate devotion to your employment, right? Well, you want to sort of, if you want to push that a little farther, in terms of psychoanalytically what's going on there, do we feel compelled to submit ourselves to that authority? Is there something else going on there? If so, would you care to elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, I think I will, and I'll also recommend another book which I'm just reviewing at the moment, which I read after writing mine, which is a book by Samo Tomsic, who's another psychoanalytic writer. It's called The Capitalist Unconscious. And in his book, he argues that it's out this just a few months ago with Verso. And he argues that the capitalist subject is the indebted worker. His book is about the relationship between Marx and Lacan. And so in some ways it's similar to mine. I'm interested in the relationship between the Marxist and the psychoanalytic way of viewing our capitalist moment. And he argues that the subject of capitalism, the modern worker, is constantly feeling indebted. That is the condition. The creditor is the central banks, your employer, the government, and everyone's position is the position of being in debt. And of course, that's practically true on a conscious level. You know, we take mortgages, student loans, credit cards, overdrafts. So we are literally in debt and always having to repay that. And it also operates unconsciously on your psychology, that you feel indebted and that you owe something back to the center, to the kind of capitalist center. And that is, I completely agree with him. And I would have made a big deal of his book had I read it before I wrote mine. But so that answers the question better than I could have done myself, really. That I think we always feel indebted, and that is how we're produced as capitalist subjects. And so when we play Candy Crush, when we do something useless, this produces the guilt, which makes us feel in debt, and therefore, you know, makes us work harder to repay that debt via sort of productive capitalist work. And another example could be a much more obvious one, which is that I think that people, these distractions work to separate people from each other. This is a more conscious one, more material one. You know, when you had a 5-minute break from work, you know, in my experience, you talk to your work colleagues. And what do you talk to your work colleagues about? Well, the only thing you really probably got in common with all of them is work. So you talk to your work colleagues at work for 5 minutes when you needed a break from work. And that would produce a kind of, not necessarily bonding, but, you know, at least you're slagging off your employer together, and it would make you more stronger as a unit, as an employee workforce. Now, when you have 5-minute breaks, you go on BuzzFeed, you watch a YouTube video, or you play Cookie Clicker or Angry Birds. And that means your 5 minutes in which you're not working is not spent building up relations with your colleagues, making you a kind of stronger unionized force. Instead, it's kind of individualized. So these games also work to kind of separate us from our fellow employees, which obviously strengthens us.
So, yes, and I mean, you could sort of go from there and look at how capitalism drives the formulation of technology itself. And the one expression of that is the atomizing effect of that technology. But I know that Candy Crush is only one example that you provide. Maybe we could talk about some of the other instances as well that you discuss in the book, to see what other facets of the question those other examples open up.
Yeah. So just quickly on that last point, then on that, you know, you use the word atomization. I think that's good. I think that's a good way of putting it. And it's that, you know, so I'm basically arguing, you could put it this way, that along with a downgrading of the unions in the political sphere is an increased individualist distraction in the cultural sphere. So yeah, both the downgrading of the unions and Candy Crush work to atomize workers from each other, and that is a problem which we do need to deal with. So moving on to what you're saying, yeah, there are other examples. So the other main my other project, well, there's two other types of enjoyment which I discuss in the book. One is things which are perceived of as really radical enjoyments. So things like literature and highbrow literature, basically, and philosophy, high quality philosophy. How we enjoy that, you know, how we enjoy those things. And I was interested in showing how the way we enjoy, say, Foucault or Deleuze, may not be as radical as we think. In fact, it may be the absolute opposite. You know, there is Deleuze as a commodity who it would be sort of turning in his grave if he saw the ways in which he was being enjoyed by many readers of these theorists. So I'm trying to unseat the idea that some enjoyment is more radical than others, and that, you know, if you enjoy Deleuze, you must be a radical individual, because I think it's quite possible to enjoy Deleuze in an equally sort of dangerous way. Oh, I think I might have just lost the sound on your video.
I had muted myself, sorry, because I have background noise. I'm trying to mitigate that. Thank you. What I was going to say was, I think it has to do with how you're relating to the text. You know, are you really like reading Deleuze as a form of enjoyment? Because if that's simply why you're reading Deleuze, then it's very easy for that activity to become appropriated and subordinated to rather, is rather, rather amenably to the capitalist framework. But there's another way of engaging that text or other similar texts which aren't nearly as friendly to that framework. So where am I going with trying to draw that distinction? Because what you're talking about is like the incredible power, I think, maybe if I'm hearing you correctly, of the framework, the capitalist framework, to even commodify revolution. So you've got like movies like that are obviously subversive, like just off the top of my cuff, you could elicit, even though they're very popular films, subversive messages from Fight Club or The Matrix or even more recently The Hunger Games, right? But people go to these films or they read these books and they're not then suddenly stirred to organize in a manner which is going to transform the system. Do you think that that's intrinsic to what they're engaging, or is it a function of how they're engaging those materials? And if it's a function of how they're engaging those materials, how does one go about changing that mode of or that vector of engagement so that it's no longer a question of them just being distractions? Yeah. Or I'm sorry, as I was talking about it more concisely, I just realized maybe this is your point, that enjoyment itself. I don't think you're saying that enjoyment is like a problem per se, but that we should be wary of looking at enjoyment itself as something which we should place centrally to our life. Yeah. Are you maybe saying something like that?
Yes. Okay. So lots of things to respond to. Yeah. I mean, one thing is that, like you said, I think there are other ways to read than enjoyment. And like when I read Deleuze or Foucault or Lacan, most of the time I consider it to be hard work and very not particularly enjoyable at all. I think when the enjoyment creeps in, you ought to be very suspicious of that. When you start to enjoy it, that can be where not there's a problem, but where there's something which is going uninterrogated, which is producing this thing called enjoyment. So that leads me to your last point. I am talking about we need to study enjoyment itself. Now, how do I see that? I mean, enjoyment is this kind of connector between an identity, a subjectivity, and an object. That is how I'm kind of thinking this through. That there's the thing. I'm not saying that enjoying. I think everyone enjoys things differently. So there's the object, and that could be Deleuze, or it could be Candy Crush. And then there's the subject, which is the person doing in front of the text, whether that's Candy Crush or Deleuze. And enjoyment is this kind of invisible connector between the subject and object, between the enjoyer and the enjoyed. And what I'm trying to do, is analyze and discuss the various different ways in which this kind of connector between you and the thing you're enjoying can function. And I think it can serve all sorts of purposes. I don't think all enjoyment is bad. Absolutely not. And all the things in the book that I discuss are things I enjoy. I do want to make that clear. I'm not saying there's enough people criticizing what other people enjoy in our society, and I don't want to be one of them. Everything I talk about is things that I enjoy, and I want to therefore pick apart what role enjoyment plays in my relationship to these things.
Right. So, just to respond to that, I don't think that you're trying to propagate a kind of Puritanism, which may be a common sort of first blush response, like, enjoyment, we're going to set that aside and remember our Calvin or whomever, right? It's rather you're calling the reader to become more conscious of what's happening with their subjectivity as they go through their day and they encounter these various things. And what is the role what's going on with their own consciousness? And I would ask you, and the question maybe sort of jumps a few moments ahead, but conceptually, but what is the relationship between our realization of freedom and enjoyment. I think that there's something to be derived from elucidating the relationship between those terms, in terms of then figuring out what about enjoyment could possibly should make us wary. So
yeah. Okay. Well, in terms of the connection between freedom and enjoyment, my interest would be in the way that you feel like you're free to enjoy what you choose. That's another kind of condition of our society, isn't it? That one is free to choose from this absolutely innumerable number of different kinds of enjoyment, and I think we feel like that choice is natural or instinctive or something inherent to us. So we feel like we've chosen what we enjoy, or we're free to choose what we enjoy. Now, one thing I want to sort of say in the book is that enjoyment chooses us. This is not a relationship. If enjoyment is a connection between the subject and object, the subject is not in control of that connection. The object is in control too, or so that the things you enjoy change and transform you as a subject, just as much as you may be able to change and transform them. So yeah, your enjoyment chooses you in a way, and it affects you, and it affects who you are. So you're not really free to enjoy what you want. Your enjoyment is kind of subscribed in some way, or
yes.
Maybe
I just, as you were talking, you reminded me from your blog. You talked the other day about the Althusserian notion of interpolation. Are you talking about something similar here?
Yeah, let me just say that. Yeah, the blog, I edit the blog, and that's actually a contribution from a new contributor called Francis Russell. But I thought it was fantastic, really insightful. His take was that popular music can play a kind of interpolating function, which brings you into a certain position. Yeah, am I saying something similar? Yes, I am saying that enjoyment plays a kind of interpolating role. Yeah, I think I am saying something like that. I feel like his article really for that reason.
It's worth. Yeah, I should put.
Go ahead. Well, on the other hand, yeah. Is that okay now? Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
Some feedback there.
Sorry about that. So it's just interesting, the whole concept of interpolation. We could maybe spell that out. The other notion that occurred to me as you were talking about this sort of, you're sort of inverting how we tend to think of enjoyment, right? By noting that I really liked your phrase, enjoyment is choosing us, and that what we enjoy affects and it transforms us. What struck me about that is that actually, then what that strikes me is it actually places more responsibility on my corner, on my shoulders, in that when I go and choose to enjoy something, I have to realize it's influencing who and what I am. And so that's going to charge me with being more mindful as to what do I really want to enjoy in my life.
Great. Just on that exact point, that's where I kind of finished the book, and I'd like to have taken it further. In the conclusion, I sort of briefly thought about what you might think of as illegal enjoyment, and I watched and mentioned a Louis Theroux documentary in which he went to a number of prisons and spoke to inmates in the prisons about their crimes. Some of these crimes were sort of sexual, some of them were violent. And a lot of these prisoners had accounted for their actions, which of course were illegal, on the grounds that they naturally had a tendency to enjoy a fight, for example. And therefore, you're born as someone who enjoys fighting, and therefore what can you do apart from follow your own enjoyments? And that is how our culture generally sees enjoyment. And I think even some very well-read critical theorists are guilty of that. So we all are guilty of seeing it in that way. So exactly what you're saying. If we changed our attitude towards that and recognise that the things we enjoy change us, rather than them being some kind of natural or instinctive tendency to enjoy certain things, then we wouldn't have that problem of feeling like we necessarily had to follow our enjoyments if they were kind of damaging or hurtful to others. And as a sort of counterpart to that, I think that we can hardly complain as a culture when people commit, when criminals turn up at the scene, when we endorse as a culture the idea that you should enjoy what you want to enjoy. You should be allowed to follow your enjoyments. If you enjoy it, you should have it. I think that's what our culture tells people, and I think that can have disastrous consequences. And that, as you rightly say, it's time to take a little bit more responsibility for enjoyment and look at it in a much more complex way than that.
And also, to connect that back to a few conversational pages ago, right? There is a tension, a contradiction between this exhortation toward even a kind of hedonism, just enjoy what you will, and then these underlying mechanisms whereby things like guilt and shame really coerce our participation in the culture of the capitalist framework, So do you think there's something there in terms of me highlighting that as a tension, and how would you spell that out? If you're still there, Alfie.
Yeah. So you mean there's a kind of difficult problem or paradox in that our society sort of tells us to enjoy whatever we want, but then also makes us feel guilty for doing so?
Well, yes. I mean, when you say it like that, right? It sounds like obvious, but yeah. I mean, what does that say? I mean, I guess the question is that something which just is part of society? Like, in a way, you could argue that's sort of what Freud was pointing to in Civilization and its discontents, is that there's like this ineradicable contradiction in our being, and that capitalism is just one. That's just how it shows up in capitalism, right?
Yeah.
So, or do you think it's possible that we can conceive of ourselves a way where we are not always on the horns of this contradiction? And then I guess one way or the other, how does we've used the notion of capitalism, the word or the concept has been in the background of this conversation. But what is capitalism, and how are we going to? I know that's a big question, but how do you conceive of yourself in relationship to it, and what are we going to do about it? So, sorry, I know.
In relation to this question of the contradiction, I mean, let's talk a bit about masturbation, because I was reading recently about these new masturbation booths which have been opened in New York. Which they're designed so that I'm just writing a piece about this now hopefully for New Inquiry, and the idea is that the worker feels distracted and they just go into the booth, 5 minutes of masturbation and then back to work. Now that is like an absolute gem, I think, for my argument and what we're just talking about, because it shows that it's completely sanctioned. This shows you've got to enjoy what you want. If you want to go and have a masturbate, you should be allowed to immediately fulfill that desire. On the other hand, you should feel guilty about that too, and come back to work with a kind of renewed passion to make it up to your employer. So, yeah, it points to exactly what we're describing as this kind of double function. That on the one hand, follow what you enjoy. On the other hand, feel guilty about it and make reparations. So I think that's a nice example from this week. This is open this week, which kind of shows one of the ways in which it might play out.
The other thing, that's extraordinary. I heard about that. The other thing that strikes me, though, is that you've designated a place. And then, that means that you're sort of announcing or at least that you're under the gaze of the proverbial panopticon or whatever, so that you're going to go and you're going to masturbate, and then the world is going to know that that's what you're doing. It's because it's extraordinary.
Yeah, and of course the ostensible methods, the gesture is, oh look how liberal we are in New York. We're so okay with it. but to my mind, it's still to do with
actually it's paradoxically sanitizing, right? It's controlling the act and the act's significance by putting it within this framework. Yes, and then it connects back, as you were saying, to what you're talking about, how these kinds of distractions actually then stifle our freedom, mitigate it, right? Or mitigate our access to a real freedom, because all of a sudden we're internally connected with this struggle with guilt and the need to atone. So, but anyway, that's you were. I sort of interrupted you. I apologize. So, I was titillated by the example there. So.
Yeah, no, I was just going to try and say something about the most difficult question you asked, which is the one about what can we do about it? Are we stuck in it or not? And I'm not sure, but I think that I don't want to say, oh, we can get free of these structures. I don't think that there is a kind of enjoyment which is free of these kind of structures of regulation, control, etc. And I don't think we should stop certain kinds of enjoyment. But I do think that the sort of ongoing analysis of enjoyment can modify and change the way the function these things play. I think that we should all carry on enjoying what we enjoy, whatever that may be. But I think that we must try to sort of think about the social function of enjoyment, and particularly the function of enjoyment in capitalism.
I just wanted to ask you in that connection, because you've drawn on the tradition of psychoanalysis as a powerful tool in that regard. But I look at what I experience, and I haven't done this directly very often, but my experience of the state of psychology and psychiatry today is one in which psychoanalysis, or the descendants of psychoanalysis, plays a diminished role, and that the narratives that we are inheriting from the psychological profession or the psychiatric profession are sort of more reductive in their view of the human being and its relationship with life, with his or her life, And in this regard, I'm wondering, do you think that is a front where there should be pushback? Should we maybe look again at psychoanalysis and those kinds of approaches to our inner or mental life, as a form of resistance to sometimes the almost pharmacological imposition of psychology and psychiatry? And these are broad brushstrokes, but
no. I mean that's a debate that's sort of in the public eye a little bit at the moment, isn't it? The question of a return to psychoanalysis and whether psychiatry and cognitive behavioural therapy are kind of normalising structures. And it's a very complex issue, and I know many people who feel very strongly about one side or the other. But what I do think is interesting I suppose what I'm doing is psychoanalysis not as a tool for therapy, but as a tool for reading, like the signs of everyday life, really. And what the question of psychoanalysis, which may be different to other psychological models, the question is, how do we kind of come into being as a subject, as an identity? And I think psychoanalysis is often misunderstood there. It's perceived of as self-indulgent. and self-celebratory. And actually, psychoanalysis at its best, in my opinion, as it should be, is not about those things at all. It's not about how good the ego is. It's about how we are constructed and brought into being as a subject, as an identity, by the sort of social conditions around us. So when you're looking at something like enjoyment, and I'm interested in the role it plays in creating us as people, psychoanalysis is an invaluable sort of tool, because it's asking the right question. How do the social conditions and discourses surrounding us produce our identities, our subjectivities? And that, I think, with enjoyment is a question we need to be asked. So I've found psychoanalysis to be very, very useful in kind of analysing the role of enjoyment. And I certainly believe in psychoanalysis as a sort of tool for reading literature, for reading everyday life as well.
I found it interesting, though, the way you say, well, I'm not using it as a tool for therapy. That provoked me to think about, well, what does that mean in any event for something to be therapeutic, right? And the notion that we're sort of setting aside this process and as, specifying it as something which can be undertaken for a specifically medical, if you like, function, right? Whereas, in fact, this mode of engagement doesn't have to be cordoned off like that. It can be used to, read books, to understand what's going on more generally. And I'm just wondering if I think that possibly by cordoning it off and specifying its function in this delimited way, you're kind of constraining its power and its potential. I was going to say usefulness, but I almost bridle with that word usefulness, because then you get the cul-de-sac of utility that way. But it's just something which occurred to me as you were speaking. I think that you're really on point there in terms of drawing on that tradition as a way to inform how we engage our world more generally. And it has a potential perhaps not simply to elucidate what's going on with enjoyment, but even like with, other facets of our lives as subjects, whether it be within a capitalist framework or another framework, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, there are rather obvious places where we could look, like, for example, it's such a pedestrian example, but like the ascendancy or the appeal of Donald Trump here in the U.S. Why is he resonating with people? What does that say about, our a desperation which pervades our culture? That's something that, but someone might come back and say I'm being patronizing by putting it like that, saying that, who am I to say that you must be desperate if you're going to appeal to, you're going to resonate with someone like Donald Trump. But anyway, all that by way of approbation of your insight.
I think it's not a bad example. It's surprised. I just thought the Donald Trump thing would have died down somewhat long time before it has. But I don't have a clear comment on that. Although I do feel that the way he's enjoyed is an issue. I think that conservative politicians often use this not at all stupid tactic. It happened with Boris Johnson in the UK. My knowledge of American politics is fairly limited, but I think that what Boris Johnson did in the UK was sort of turn himself into a figure who was enjoyed. And people couldn't really work out whether he was hated or loved. But in the end, that made him massively popular and get loads of votes. And I think that, there's Donald Trump is managing something quite similar, isn't he? We all just desperately enjoy talking about him, whether we sort of love or hate it. And it doesn't seem to be, it seems to only be doing him a favor.
Actually, another thing is like enjoying conversation, right? Like we can enjoy talking about things that we love and that we hate. But if we're just talking for the sake of our own sort of scintillation, is that kind of conversation really going to move us forward? Obviously, they create a disjunction where, like, well, if we're not going to talk for enjoyment, well, why talk, right? But then, it comes back to, in a way, what we've discussed, how obviously you can't just throw enjoyment out the window, but you have to become conscious of what's going on with that process, right? What's the intentionality in the background, and that may be something that helps responding to a situation, whether it's capitalism, politically or economically. You're participating in a conversation about that. Those themes. You have to ask yourself, why am I talking about this?
I think I've just lost you.
It's really good.
I think I've lost your video. Yeah, you've gone. Hello?
Jump in.
I think you've come back. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what.
Is the video quality all right on me?
You're fine on your end. I think that the problem is basically on my end because, again, my signal here isn't the best. But I think we could almost come to a point where we could wrap it up a bit.
Yeah.
Alfie. So you sort of covered the terrain.
Yeah, we've covered it. Yeah, we've done well.
And I guess, one thing I'd like to point out, maybe in conclusion, besides for your book, enjoying it, is that you also manage this blog, Everyday Analysis. And in a way, you're doing what you're doing and enjoying it on a sort of broader scale, you and other contributors, in terms of bringing to bear certain notions, concepts, ideas, etc., and applying them to the everyday in a way which is somewhat atypical. But perhaps appropriate and, I think has promise in terms of emancipating the conversation publicly from its rather low ebb, in my view. So why don't you talk a little bit about everyday analysis by way of rounding out the exchange here?
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's a good place to finish because I could also say we're always looking for new contributors if any of your listeners are interested. It's called Everyday Analysis, but it's not actually primarily about psychoanalysis. I mean, many of us use a psychoanalytic framework to discuss everyday life, but others are, Marxists, feminists, deconstructionists. So basically the idea is we're a big collective of people interested in critical theory who want to use critical theory to analyze everyday stuff. So it can be stuff from the news, stuff from popular culture, anything really. And we've just signed a contract for the third book, which will be out with Zero Books. And we've probably had 40 contributors in the couple of years we've been running. But we're always looking for new people who want to write articles on everyday culture, popular culture, and just have you correctly describe our kind of aim is just to kind of open the conversation a bit, discuss something which is usually ignored, a part of everyday life, and kind of open up questions about it, what its role is culturally, socially. If anyone wants to, just go on everydayanalysis.com and get in touch with us.
Well, outstanding, Alfie, and thank you so much for doing the interview here. It'll be up. Put it up on YouTube here within the next 24 hours, and we'll have all the appropriate links in the description. And of course, everybody go ahead and check out Alfie's book, Enjoying It, Candy, Crush and Capitalism. You can get that at Zero Books. It's probably on Amazon and other places as well. And the blog, Everyday psychoanalysis.com. So we'll round it out there. Thanks again, Alfie. And
thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.